Generally speaking, there are two explanations for political differences between people. Mistake theory posits that the reason libertarians and, say, Marxist-Leninists don't agree with each other is that we have firmly held genuine beliefs about how to solve problems in the world. Politics is simply the science of society, and good politics tend towards the greatest good. Most people simply differ on how best to achieve the greatest good. Conflict theory, on the other hand, maintains that politics is the result of concentrated human effort to gain at the expense of others. Communists certainly believe in a conflict of economic classes throughout history. Many right-wingers believe in a conflict between civilizational or racial groups. If you asked many modern self-identified libertarians or classical liberals, they would instinctively reject the idea of conflict theory, that it calls back to a more brutish, less cooperative way of seeing and interacting with the world. Economics is a zero-sum game, so why not politics as well? However, there's a long liberal tradition of class conflict. Indeed, it can be said that modern class theory originated not with Marx, but with the classical liberals and proto-liberals of 17th and 18th century Europe. Our class theory is that of the plundering class and the plundered class. The violent apparatus of the state, its executive directors, and parasitic clients and vassals make up the plundering class, stealing from and lording over the mass of men that work for a living. Frederick Bastiat and many others use the term spoliation, rendered in most English translations as legal plunder, to refer to this inactivity, similar to exploitation's place in Marxist theory. Just as a Marxist would not bother spending all his time debating the exploitive class in his society, but instead organizing to defeat them and to empower the proletariat, the class-conscious liberals sought to overthrow the feudal and absolutist regimes that stifled competition, placed onerous, regressive taxes on the common man, and richly rewarded its friends with its ill-gotten proceeds. The result was the Age of Revolution, the American War for Independence, and the Springtime of Nations. Murray Rothbard, Mr. Libertarian, only tweaked the ancient liberal class theory to include all governments and all its agents. As Rothbard said about all his works, his was merely a fully consistent liberal program. The question for him was not how to convince men who made their living from the plunder of the peaceful and productive with intellectual appeals, but how to organize and radicalize the plundered class. To understand how the ruling class of a given society operates, classical liberal sociologists, led by Italian polymath Vilfredo Pareto, created what is now known as elite theory. Pareto also studied how new elite classes are created and replace the old. Insofar as there remains a naive libertarianism that posits mistake over conflict theory to explain the expansion of the state, classical elite theory is useful. But many other factions of the political spectrum have claimed that elite theory, despite Pareto's actual position, confirmed their beliefs. So let us look at Pareto, the man, and his work. Vilfredo was born in Paris in 1848, that most auspicious year, to Italian parents of devout liberal beliefs. The Pareto family was famous throughout Genoa for its republicanism, sheltering Mazzini after the first failure of what became the Italian Unification Wars, waged by liberals against the reactionary puppets of the Austrian Empire to create a free Italy. Although the centralization of the consequent new state that promoted the power of the ascendant industrializing North against the rural South was anything but progressive. Training as a young man in engineering, he was drawn into political economy by the writings of a man who died when he was only 2 years old, Frederick Bastiat. Quote, "I was approximately 16 when I chanced to read two authors of a completely opposite nature, Bossuet, a 17th century French theologian, and Bastiat. I heartily disliked the first, whereas the second fully pleased my sentiments, which under this respect were in utter contrast with those of the people who surrounded me at the time, such as I can state that they weren't acquired, but were a consequence of the temperament I had since my birth." Bastiat made him a committed anti-statist, a man who always upheld the basic liberal principles of free trade, free minds, and free markets. Bastiat's successor, Gustave de Molinari, was a friend and close correspondent of Pareto, who referred to him as maître, master. Molinari was the first liberal theorist to suggest the privatization of that industry long held as a basic government function, security. Yves Guyot, Molinari's disciple, was also lauded by Pareto for coming out in defense of the French Jew Dreyfus in 1898, making common cause with many French socialists against the reactionary military that framed the artillery officer for treason. Indeed, Pareto himself wrote an editorial for the main Italian socialist magazine Avanti, supporting Dreyfus. Having spent most of his life in the private sector as an engineer, in 1880 Pareto began vocally opposing what he saw as destructive statist policies in modern Italy. While Italy was led by nominally liberal factions, what's known today as Sinistra Storica, or the historical left, a nod to the fact that the original left wing was classical liberalism against the feudalist right, practical politics had prevented Italy from removing significant trade barriers, and freedom of organization and assembly, especially by rural peasants and industrial workers, was suppressed. Pareto, despite his opposition to the emerging socialist movement, often sheltered leftist activists and always defended the right of trade unionists to organize. In 1891, one of the public speeches Pareto gave against trade tariffs actually got broken up by the police as an affront to public order. His public articles on these topics often got him death threats and challenges from the aristocratic right to duels. Challenges which Pareto never backed away from. A crack shot and handy with a blade, and the son of a marquis besides, though he would insist people not address him by his noble rank, but by his earned rank of doctor. Pareto would practice his marksmanship by blasting mice on his estate. A skilled mathematician that applied his genius not just to his business career, but to his love of knowledge and truth, Pareto was the originator of the Pareto principle, a theory of distribution that held in a dizzying number of real-world cases. 20% of a country's population controls 80% of its income, causes 80% of its crime, causes 80% of healthcare costs, etc. His study of economics also gained us the concept of the Pareto improvement, a public policy concept that hurts nobody but gains at least something for one party. As a student of Leon Walras, one of the holy trinity of the marginal revolution, including Austria and Karl Menger, that destroyed the Marxian concept of objective theory of value, he inherited Walras's position at the prestigious University of Lausanne, Switzerland, in 1893, leaving behind an Italy that was becoming increasingly dangerous for him, an outspoken proponent of peace and freedom to live in. Pareto saw what he called the bourgeois elite in Italy as basically sleepwalking into socialism. On one hand, they refused to listen to the prescriptions of the economists of Manchester and the French liberal school to sweep away all the feudal privileges and elevate men with the animating contest of freedom. On the other, their suppression of left-wing opposition from the poor and their advocates only strengthened the resolve of socialist thinkers and activists. Pareto pointed out how weak socialism was in Switzerland, where liberalism was far closer to pure, and how strong socialism was in Spain, where liberalism was barely existent. When some self-identified admirers talk about Pareto's lambasting of his ruling class, they'll point to the general observation he made that the Italian bourgeois, indeed the European bourgeois, was too morally and intellectually cowardly to defend its own position. Certainly anyone of any ideological strain can take from this that men must have the courage of their own convictions. But more specifically, Pareto was attacking the lack of liberalism in those liberal elites. By the mid-1890s, the fever of new imperialism had reached Italy. Liberals in government, like the liberals in the governments of France and Britain, started clamoring for increased military budgets, bigger navies, and also to expand Italy's sphere of influence. Some of the biggest waves of death threats to Pareto were during his courageous stance against the Italian adventurism in East Africa, especially the disastrous Ethiopian campaign in 1896, where the uncivilized black barbarians soundly defeated an army that had pretensions of being a major world power. The move, aided and abetted by so-called liberals to create a Europe of heavily armed camps, resulted in that Europe finally exploding in 1914. Pareto watched as the collective wealth of Europe, invested in battleships, great fortresses, and millions of firearms, evaporated for little gain. Certainly for Italy, promised much by the Entente to betray the Triple Alliance, the lack of show for all the dead and maimed was too painful for conventional politics, and the vilified politicians who promised everything and delivered nothing to survive. New forces were rising to challenge the only credible old party, that is, the faction of the Italian Socialist Party that resisted calls for war. But the leader of the pro-war faction, Benito Mussolini, whom Pareto had met as a socialist fugitive in Switzerland 20 years before, part of Pareto's extension of goodwill towards honest socialists fighting the real tyranny of the plutocratic Italian state, had created a movement that went from a tiny band of street thugs to challenging the other sclerotic factions in Italy that feared Bolshevism ruling Italy as well as Russia. As the fascist party grew in power, being charged with forming a government in late 1922, Pareto hoped that fascism wouldn't just head off communism, but would sweep away the old bourgeois elite, and though not convinced fascism itself would last, was hopeful that this circulation of elite would lead to better, more courageous, and, perhaps a bit too hopefully here, more liberal ones. Pareto died just before being able to accept a prestigious position in the Mussolini government in summer 1923, and Mussolini eulogized the man, calling him, quote, the most illustrative of his teachers. Socialists and other left-wingers were quick to point to this as proof that fascism is truly liberalism in crisis, or the idea that Pareto was no true liberal at all, but instead, as Karl Popper put it, a theoretician of totalitarianism. Some right-wingers, such as Nima Parvini, a self-identified acolyte of Pareto, who wrote a book about elite theory called The Populist Delusion, say the same, but only as an embrace of the true, clear-eyed, ex-libertarian lens of power and history. In opposition to these claims, we should emphasize that at no point did Pareto support emergency measures to decay the rule of law, or the freedom of speech and assembly, or the cessation of the normal processes of the free market to oppose the specter of Bolshevism. Quite the contrary, we have editorials and correspondence by him during the 1920s opposing these things. Pareto's defense of fascism is merely to observe the total fecklessness of so-called liberal elites towards both the rising threat of the socialists who wanted to absolutely destroy private property, and also towards the fresh class of elites that eventually, but as always, temporarily, replaced them. Pareto did not cause the king to give power to Mussolini, and as Mises tried to do in his position as economic advisor during the Austro-fascist regime of Dollfuss in the 30s, Pareto felt the need to give advice in favor of freedom, if asked. His apprentice Gaetano Mosca, who lived to see the kind of harsh repression Mussolini was willing to employ to secure total power, put himself in harm's way by publicly condemning fascism in 1925, probably only protected from extrajudicial murder because he was appointed senator for life. Libertarians can take much from Pareto. Friedrich Hayek sought to understand the collapse of liberalism in the 20th century with elite theory, writing Intellectuals and Socialism in 1949, an article that echoes much of Pareto's observations about the intellectual cowardice of bourgeois conservatives nominally in power in the Western democracies, that they were giving away all their moral and institutional ground to the left because they refused to understand the reality that it was not the beliefs of the masses, but of those elites in society that truly mattered. Like Pareto, his prediction for the future of liberalism in the West was pessimistic, if not completely hopeless. Quote, "It may be that a free society as we have known it carries in itself the forces of its own destruction, that once freedom has been achieved, it is taken for granted and ceases to be valued, and that the free growth of ideas, which is the essence of a free society, will bring about the destruction of the foundations on which it depends. Does this mean that freedom is valued only when it is lost? That the world must everywhere go through a dark phase of socialist totalitarianism before the forces of freedom can gather strength anew? It may be so, but I hope it need not be. Murray Rothbard also understood the importance of elites in the loss of liberalism to statism, not only in our own period, but in his great posthumous work, The Progressive Era. But at the very founding of our country, in Volume 5 of Conceived of Liberty, documenting the way a small, directed core of right-wing nationalists contrived to replace the Articles of Confederation with the centralizing, anti-libertarian Constitution. Quote, "The nationalist leaders, in contrast to their wavering opponents, knew exactly what it wanted and strove to obtain the most possible. The initiative was always in the hands of the Federalist right, while the anti-Federalist left, weakened in principle, could only offer a series of defensive protests to the reactionary drive. The battles were consequently fought on terms set by the aggressive nationalist forces." One of our first videos on this channel was on the subject of libertarian Leninism, a concept taken from Rothbard himself. Libertarian activists cannot simply wait for the masses or a nascent elite to come to us. We must train a dedicated cadre of intellectuals who take our ideas with grave moral seriousness. We need men who hate the state, and we need men who understand that our principal opponents are not fools on social media, but the plundering class that educates them and teaches them that true liberalism was guilty of a litany of atrocities, just as much as it is the men who enforce those rules. Vilfredo Pareto was not a simple figure, but his work in uncovering the truth about elites, how they gain power, and how they lose it, is essential to any fight for liberty having a chance of success. Long live liberalism, and may 1,000 flowers bloom.